Okay, so for today's project, I'm going to be putting the front axle on. Hopefully you can hear me talking today because it's raining and I'm in a metal building. I kind of messed up versus what the service manual calls for. They actually call to have this bolster, cradle, whatever you want to call it, off the tractor. Mount the axle and the radius rod to it and then lift all this on. Well, I could technically still do that, but I really don't want to take it off. So I'm going to try and put the axle and the radius rod in there as it sits. Can't really see it on this side, but over here I have a cinder block and a bunch of 2x4s stacked up. And I'm basically going to just set everything underneath it and lift it and wiggle it until I can get it into place. A couple things I don't think I mentioned yet. The radius rod bushing is actually a axle knee bushing for the upper. I want to say the number was a 2N3109. It's a little short, but it does work. And as far as the pin goes, neither one of these pins are available, so I had to make my own. The front pin was pretty easy. This was 1 3/4 inch 4140 chrome moly rod that I basically just ground a notch into using a mini belt sander and then cut it to length. That was the easy pin to make. This pin is also 4140 chrome moly, and I had to drill a 3/8 hole in it to run the roll pin in. This pin was a nightmare because this is actually my second attempt at this, and this is a $45 pin. So I had to buy a carbide drill bit to drill this because it is hardened. This one's also hardened, I forgot to mention that. And then I had to buy a centering jig to center all this up. So this pin is probably $150 to $200 counting all the tooling. So keep that in mind. The bushing on this pin and the front axle is the same as an 8N all the way up through the 1964 tractor. I can't remember the number offhand. I'll be sure to put that at the bottom of the video for you. Okay, and one other tidbit here. The radius rod bolts through the front axle using the same bolts as the 600 and 800. They are available, reproduced from Dennis Carpenter. The number is NAA3415B. But with all the talking done, let's start to get this thing put together. The first part I'm going to set here is the front axle itself. I got it just kind of sitting in there. A couple other things I need to mention, and this kind of is on the pins. On the rear pin, there is this spacer, retainer, I'm not sure exactly what Ford calls it. The one on my tractor was wore out, no surprise there. So I made this basically from scratch, used the old one kind of as a template. The only place I could measure the old one and get an accurate measurement was down here on this little tang. It measured 120 thousandths. And so closest thing to that is actually 1/8 of an inch, which is 125. So that's what I made this out of instead of buying a special piece of metal. I figure 5 thousandths is not going to cause me an issue. But that'll go onto this pin once we start to install it. This little tang will go towards the rear of the tractor. On your front pins, there's these spacers here that you can buy. There's these thin washer looking ones, and then there's a big one about that big that looks like a sleeve. I have no idea what you're supposed to use on this as far as the configuration is concerned, because the manual calls for whatever's necessary. My 8N had, I think, neither of these. My 861 had one of these, I think. This tractor had one of these. which I mean, I've done the 8N and stuff like 10 10 years ago, so I may be telling you wrong. My 8N right now has no spacers. It doesn't affect it at all. The 861 has the big sleeve spacer in it to help hold the bushing into the axle because it's a little warped. This axle actually welded up and made the bushing fit really snug, so I hopefully won't have that issue. But when I took this tractor apart, there was one of these in front of the axle. So I got one new one. That's where it's going to go back. All right, so now that I got my axle sitting here, I'm going to go ahead and snake the radius rod in here, and then I will use our bolts and get that attached. That way I can start to lift this up into position. Now I'll have to go get some more boards more than likely to help lift this up in there, just due to the simple fact this thing's heavy and awkward, and it's easy to lift it up one little bit at a time and just slide a board underneath and get it up into the tractor. Which, if you have this on the ground, I would suggest you do that as well. And your boards will just be on the other side. It'll help you get everything lined up. Now when you do this on a 600 or 800, you do not have to assemble this. This is for the wide front row crop only. And that's just due to the simple design of it. The 600, 800, 8N, 9N, 2N, all that, you can put your axle in and put your big pin in first, and then attach your radius rods and just swing them onto the side of the tractor. And you can see how nice and tight I've got these things fitting now. This was all wore out. I'm not sure exactly what video I had it on, but it's on one of my teardown videos where all this stuff was just wore slap out. And everything is now nice and tight. And these bolts, they get just a nut on the bottom. No lock washer or washer or anything. And they're going to torque to, I think it said 75 to 135, which I don't have a torque wrench with me at the moment, so I'll have to do that later. So now that I have that somewhat situated, I'm going to start to try to get it lined up and moved into location. My pins on this, the front pin slides really easily. My rear pin slides into the cradle real easily, but is very stiff in the radius rod. So I'm going to try to get the front pin in first. All I'm doing right now is just adding my boards, moving them around and whatnot to try to get it lifted up higher. And I'm pretty close on the front one now. I lack like maybe half an inch or so. So I'm going to go ahead and start getting the pin ready to go into it. Now, I may piss off some of the purists with this. The grease that I put in this grease gun is a John Deere lithium grease with 3% moly in it. And I did that because I figured John Deere knows how to make greases that fit their tractors. You know, their spec for their tractors versus running an off-the-shelf grease. And the reason this is moly grease, John Deere refers to it as a special purpose. This is designed for pins and low-speed applications. Well, all we're doing here is pivoting on pins. So that's what I've got here to go into my axle, and it's also recommended for ball joints. So that's where it's going to go. They do make a polyurea multi-purpose grease, which is designed for like U-joints and stuff, which is probably good for your PTO shafts. But I think for the most part, this grease will work great on the tractor itself. So we're going to use this. The first thing I'm going to do is just kind of reach in here and put a little bit of grease on the bushing. Because for whatever reason, there's no way to grease this bushing during the life of it. It's weird. So definitely want to be sure it's good and greased. So now that I have that greased, I want to grease the pin itself. And the pin on this tractor wants to install from the rear. There's kind of a lip on the front of the bore. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be there or not. And I didn't grind it off or anything before I painted. But it does slide in from the rear of the bore, so it'll work just fine. I'll set the grease gun up here for now. And then we'll take this pin and install it. Now, the notch on this pin, which I didn't film any of this taking it apart because I just had to fight it basically, and I just didn't film it. Because this front axle pin came out in 3 pieces. And it was basically locked up in the front housing here. I ended up having to actually drill this out and then cut it in half with a sawzall and knock it out, so it was a nightmare. But this notch on this pin gets locked into place with this tapered pin. So the notch will kind of face downward, but it'll be slightly angled when the pin contacts it. So when you install this pin, install your notch towards the bottom. And also don't forget whatever combination spacer you have in front of your axle. All right, I'm gonna add a bottle jack at the rear of the radius rod just to help kick it up a little bit and help straighten it up versus just the 2 blocks. All right, so there's that kind of in position. So now I should be able to lift my axle up and get the pin into it. Okay, so my pin is in the axle. I'm just having to tap it just a little bit. So I'll stick my spacer in here. Okay, so there's that front axle pin in. I still got to put the lock pin in it and clean up some of the grease. So now I got to go to the rear and put the rear pin in. And like I said, the rear pin's quite a bit tighter. And once this pin is installed, we got a new roll pin to put in it. I grease that rear bushing. Probably should have greased these before I lifted them up, but I just got ahead of myself. I can tell you this one's going to be really fun because it doesn't line up perfect. I got a board on my bottle jack just to kind of spread the load out. I'm using the jack to push this up into position. So now I get to try to fit this one in, and this one's gonna fight me. Hopefully not too terribly bad, but I know it's going to. When you put this pin in, I don't know if you can see me on the camera or not, I can't really see anything. But when this pin goes in, be sure to put your roll pin hole sideways. Okay, so I was able to get the radius rod put in. I ended up having to unbolt the rod from the axle to get it to wiggle around enough to get it in, just due to the simple fact I have this front end so tight that there's no play in anything. And I'll put a flashback in right here to show you what it was initially. If you didn't watch my teardown video, this is how bad it was whenever I started. It's a good shot of how wore out everything is up here. Look at that. It should not be that loose. Shouldn't really be loose at all. It should be nice and tight. And as you can see now, this does not flex in any way, shape, or form. That's nice and tight, up and down. Maybe even a little too tight, but it'll wear in and be just fine. Okay, so I got the roll pin into the rear pin of the tractor, or the radius rod if you want to call it that, rather. So now I got to install this front tapered pin. And it's going to install with the taper facing up from the left hand side of the tractor. And then it gets a washer and a nut. I'm going to add just a little bit of grease on this pin. I hope I never have to take it back out, but in case I do, maybe that grease will save it from being rusted in. So we're going to install the pin. And I got mine pushed in all the way. Great thing about having everything cleaned up. Install a flat washer and a new nut. And this gets torqued to 50 to 55 foot-pounds if I remember correctly. That's kind of as tight as I want to tighten that. I'm unsure on that pin. I kind of damaged it taking it out, so. That and the groove I got cut in this kingpin here is a little deeper than factory. I don't want to try to pull that wedge all the way out or through it. But our axle still moves. Like I say, she's stiff, but it's kind of expected. Well, actually I'm going to have to tighten it down further because this kingpin is pivoting. So I'll have to go get a deep socket and torque that down, make sure that doesn't rock on me. Alright, so now I got that pin torqued. My kingpin does not pivot, but very tight. Like I said, that should wear itself in and be just fine. Especially considering that tractor is a whole lot heavier than me. And I can push it up and down, so it should be good. So the next part I'm going to install is going to be this left axle knee. Your axle knee has these two bushings in it. The upper bushing is the same bushing as what's on an 8N. I think the part number for it is actually a 2N3109. This bushing is actually the same as radius rod. The only difference is it's a little short. So you can use this bushing in the radius rod, even though it gives you a different part number. It is the correct inner and outer diameters. And you can stick this in a vise or do this on the tractor if you want. I'm doing it here on some carpet since I have fresh paint. If you do this on the tractor, I suggest go ahead and supporting this axle in some sort so you're not banging on your center kingpin bushing. So the first bushing we're going to put in is right there. And you're just going to hammer it until it's flush with the top of the knee. I'm going to just use this larger one to make sure it's good and seated. So there's that one installed. So now we're just going to flip it over. And we're going to install a larger bushing. Same process, just hammer it until it seats flush into the bottom. Okay, so there's that installed. But the knee's ready to go back on the tractor now. And I want this tractor to be narrow, to try to match my other ones as close as possible. So I have my bolt in the most outer hole, because each one of these holes up through here will move this further out. So I'm going to stick the knee on that way. Next up, we got two big old washers. These are replacements because I had a mismatched one. However, the bolts are originals. I kind of debated on leaving these as yellow zinc because that's the way my 861 is, but I think on this tractor this axle's too prominent. Those stick out like a sore thumb, so they're going to be painted. Torque spec on these bolts is 220 to 250 foot-pounds, and since these are originals, I'm torquing mine down to 230 and throwing my socket in the floor. It's 230. All right, so now it's time to start putting front spindles, wheel hubs, and front wheel and tire back on. A couple of notes on these spindles. The other side I had to replace because somebody had one out of something in there that was completely wore out. I don't know what the deal was. So I had to buy an aftermarket one. On these wide front row crops, the spindles are reversed. So I needed a right side spindle, but I had to purchase a left side because they're listed as fitting the 600s and 800s. So just keep that in mind. If you have to buy one, you got to buy the opposite side. The second thing that I ran into was the notch up here where the bolt goes in was machined about 1/8 of an inch too low. So I had to come in here and notch it up higher to get the bolt into it. So that's kind of the two things that you need to be aware of on the spindles. Alright, so now we're going to start putting this in here. First, before we put the spindle in, we got to put a thrust bearing in it. Or on it rather, it's not really going into it. So So these thrust bearings I actually just got from tractor parts dealer. And they have no grease in them. So I'm going to pack some of the John Deere grease in there. It should still be a low speed application, and plus you're going to get grease from this tube that'll get pushed down into it, and I don't want difference of grease, so the John Deere Molly grease is what's going to go in here. And if you look at these thrust bearings, you'll have basically a cup and a flat surface. Well, this flat surface needs to face downward towards your spindle, because that's what's actually going to carry the load and pivot. So let's get some grease in here. And I'm going to take the spindle. Like I say, machine surface is going down. Onto the spindle. And I'm going to take some grease, put here on the two wear surfaces, which I will fully grease this tractor before actually using it. This is just to kind of help with assembly, more than anything. And this should just slide up through everything. I may have to hammer it a little bit due to the paint that I have here at the top, but it should just slide right up nice and easily. And see, the paint's holding me up right now. So I'm going to take a rubber mallet and just kind of tap it upwards. And twist it and everything, just to try to get it up through. So I took and sanded off the paint. It was fighting me a little too much. Okay, so let's see if it'll cooperate this time. Alright, so maybe I should have ground on this top a little bit. But as you see, it's in there and it spins. It's not locked up. Although I'm wore out now. Alright. So now we got our spindle in. First part we're going to put on is a new spindle dust seal. This one here doesn't really have an up or down. I've had these in the past where they're kind of cut in the side. This one here is basically just a giant O-ring. There is a groove cut here on the inside. I'm going to put that downward. And it just slides over the top of our spindle. Next up we have the steering arm and our woodruff key. The woodruff key just goes into the notch in the back side of the spindle, and then your steering arm will go on top. And be sure you have the right arm for the right side, because they are different. I don't really like these seals because they're so stiff. I can't get the key to stay in where it needs to, and they fight me. Alright, so we've got that lined up. Hammer the arm down on. we look good and clear on our bolt notch. Then we'll put our bolt and our lock washer on. And we'll torque this to 45 foot-pounds. So I've already got 45 at least on it, so we're good. You can see the spindle turns. So now my next step is going to be to install wheel bearings in front hub. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, since we've already got our new races in our hub, we got to pack our wheel bearings first, and then we got to install them. And then I'll take our inner bearing, and I got the hub sitting here on the ground upside down, and I'll go ahead and drop that one into the hub. The next thing we're going to install is going to be the seal. Okay, so there's our seal installed. Before you put this on, take a little bit of your wheel bearing grease and put it on this edge of your seal. Otherwise it'll squeak when you drive. And I know it's a tractor, but trust me, it's annoying. So now, you'll slide your hub on until it seats that bearing. Now, take your outer bearing and slide it in. Next up is going to be the washer. Then we're going to install our castle nut. I just have an 1/8 inch by 2 inch cotter pin. I'm going to slide that in. We'll bend the legs up and around the nut and down and around the nut. We're just going to put that cap in there and tighten her down. Alright, last thing I got to do to this front axle before I put the wheels on it is the actual steering drag links or tire rods, whatever you want to refer to them as. The first piece I got to do, I got to do the steering arm. That's going to bolt to our steering upright into the rear 2 holes, and these bolts are going to torque to 150 foot-pounds. And then I'll get that bolted down. Alright, so the next thing is going to be the actual tie rod itself. Alright, so on your tie rod, this is your center tube right here. This clamp is welded to the tube. Clamp down here is removable. On the ball joints, my original inner joint was perfectly fine, so I just cleaned it up, repainted it, put a new boot on it. It's good to go. The outer joint was some kind of fabric cobbled crap that I just didn't feel comfortable with, so I wanted to replace them. The original outer tie rod was long enough to go all the way into here, and that was so that whenever you extend the front end of the tractor out, but when you would widen the tractor, since this tube runs almost parallel with the axle, the tie rod had to get longer. You know, on regular tractor, they probably got a little bit longer because, you know, you twisted them like this, you know, to compensate for the axle going further out. But since this one runs parallel, the joint had to slide out. So these joints here are actually off of the later model 4000, and I can get you the part number for them. I'll put that down here at the bottom of the video. But this is the correct style as far as how it's attached. because this is not threaded. This just slides into here, and a bolt goes through that notch and locks it into place. So this was kind of the closest thing that I could get that would work. And it's probably going to be sticking out, oh, maybe we might be on the third notch here, which is, it's okay, it'll work. So it might look a little like that. And that's going to get a 1/2 inch bolt. So we put that 1/2 inch bolt in it, and I know mine's a little long. The local hardware store don't have quarter sizes, so this is actually a 1/2. So I'll probably come back and cut the end off of it and make it look a little more presentable, yeah, versus having a big old end sticking out on it like that. But I got that just loosely set in there right now. This inner joint, this threaded area is going to get painted some more, just so it looks nicer. But I am going to go ahead and put some grease on here just to make adjusting this one easier. The outer joint, you could probably grease it some. Probably should, in all honesty. But I'll work with that probably later. Alright, so let's put a little grease there on the end of it. And I'll probably get some more flack for this, but this is that John Deere grease, that Molly 3% grease. The more I use this on this front end assembly, the more I really like it. So I would actually highly recommend this grease. I really like it so far. Alright, so we're going to thread this in about halfway. Okay, so put it about right there for starters. And that's going to get carriage bolt, lock washer, and a nut. There again, kind of long, so probably have to fix that. And now that joint will be down, this joint will be up. I'm just going to stick it down in there. And then just stick it up into the knuckle, or the outer steering arm rather. Okay, so that's how we're going to install them. And I got to go install the other side real quick. And then I'll show you how you set your front toe adjustment on these tractors. Alright, so now that I have both tie rods installed, it's time to set the toe in. As you can see, this one here is towed in just a little bit. It's fairly straight. This one over here is towed in quite a bit. And I think I may have this at the very top of the screen, maybe off the screen. The steering pivot arm up here at the top is perfectly straight up and down. So that means my wheels will be pointing straight. So the first thing I'm going to do, since I have outer tie rods both on my third notch, I'm going to lift this up out of the joint. Well, I'm actually going to just take it out because it's easier to do at the moment. And since I need this hub to straighten this way, I need to shorten this link. So to shorten the link, I'm going to turn this joint further in. see what that does. Still, oops, I actually told y'all. Oh, that's right. Still pretty towed in. So I'm going to take and thread this rod or this joint all the way in. And let me see if that gets me a good toe or not. If not, I'll have to adjust the outer joint. Okay, so I got that fairly straight. And whenever you are adjusting this, try to do the same thing to each side. And what I mean is don't have one tie rod 30 inches long where the other one's 20. And I'm just throwing numbers out there. So we'll come to this side and do the same thing. Try to get this joint, or this one, about in that area. Okay, so now I have them fairly straight. Yeah, they're fairly straight. So now, I'm going to take a tape measure and go off the front of the hub and the rear of the hub and see what my measurements are. The toe end that we want is 1/4 to 1/2 inch off of the tire. Now, the tire is going to amplify whatever that hub does. So if I have, this is going to be a little extreme here. Say if I have the tire sitting like this, that's towed in a lot, my hub will probably only be towed in, maybe 1/2 of that. So for setting this up without the tire on, I'm going to shoot for 1/8 to 1/4 inch on my hub. Then once I get the tire on it, I'll double check to see if I got that 1/4 to 1/2 inch toe in. Okay, so what we're going to do first, if you have 2 people, this is a whole lot easier. You're going to hook the hub on the front and come over here to this hub in the front. I'm showing 61.5 inches. Then we're going to go to the rear. And the same thing, just hook the hub right in the center, come over here, and I'm showing 62.1/16. So I have 1/2 inch of toe in right now. But like I say, I want that little less since I don't have the wheels on there. So I'm going to take and turn each one of these inner joints one more turn. Which is basically bottomed the thread out on this one. So I may come back and slide this outer joint to the 2nd notch instead of the 3rd notch, which will then extend this one out. And that's just so I have adjustment once I get the tires on. Alright, so now I'll measure it again and see what I've got. And I have 62.1/16. So that basically didn't move anything. And since this one's already bottomed out, I'll probably go ahead and move this and then readjust everything. See, now that I have moved this outer joint 1 tooth or 1 notch further in, to now lengthen this rod, I just have to spin the inner joint out, which that will make the toe come back in if I need to tow it back in. Because shortening this overall length by moving this outer joint in will take this hub and turn it out, or tow it out. That's basically what I've done, or I'm working on rather, is taking this joint, this outer tie rod joint, and shorten it so that way it actually tows it out. So then I just lengthen this whole assembly by spinning the inner one further out. Okay, and as you can see, this hub now is facing out. And this hub is facing outward some as well. So now we'll measure it again. Now I've got 62 and an 8 on the front. So since I had 62 and an 1/8 on the front, I'm probably going to show 61 and a half roundabout here on the rear now. So I'm at 61 and 3/8. Okay, so now I went from being towed in to being towed out. So to get that fixed, these rods got to be shortened. Or no, I just told you that wrong. To get my tow in back, these rods have to be lengthened. So to lengthen them, we'll spin the inner joint outwards. It still looks towed way out. 62. And I got 61 and 5/8. Let's tow it out some more, or tow it in some more rather. So I'm taking pretty big swings at it here, trying to get it close. Once I get it closer, you can count how many times you rotate it, and it'll get you close on your tow. And all we're working with right this minute is total tow. We're not worried about the steer head or anything of that nature, because that's going to be on our drag length that runs back to our steering box. 61 and 3/4. And I got 61 and 3/4. So at the moment, my tires are going perfectly straight ahead. So I'm at 0 tow. So since I want 1/4 to 1/2 inch with the tire and an 1/8 roughly to 1/4 inch without the tire, I'm going to pull each link, spin it one time, and see where it gets me. 61 and 5/8 and 61 and 7/8. So that's 1/4 inch of toe in as it sets right now without the wheels. So I'm going to leave it at that. Your clamps, tighten them down to about 20 foot-pounds. Your castle nut, lock nut on your joint, on both ball joints. Manual calls for 90 to 130. Good luck getting that without an impact. So probably just give this a few ugga-duggas and you'll be okay. And then that's the whole front end reassembled, with the exception of the front tires. And just to throw it in there, the front wheels and tires, I took mine, dismounted the tire, sandblasted and painted the rim inside and out, put a new inner tube in it and brand new tires. I did all the tire work at work, so I did not film any of it, with the exception of blasting and painting. Any competent tire shop should be able to handle these for you, since they're just a 16-inch rim. The rear wheels are probably going to be more specialty. You have to find a certain tire shop or ag tire dealer to take care of those for you. But pretty much any tire shop can do these frontends for you. And these are not weighted also. So I'm going to go ahead and get all mine bolted down and tighten down the spec.